The debate over gun violence continues in the United States in the wake of last month's shooting at a Connecticut primary school which claimed 26 lives. The powerful National Rifle Association is essentially against any move to further limit access to firearms. But former Congresswoman and shooting victim Gabrielle Giffords today launched a new campaign for gun safety to counter, she says, the NRA's influence. Giffords and her astronaut husband Mark Kelly are both gun owners and defenders of the Second Amendment right of Americans to bear arms, but they do want to see more limits on the type of weapons available and more stringent background checks on those who seek to buy guns. Vice President Joe Biden is now heading a White House task force looking at the issue of gun violence. He'll be meeting with the NRA tomorrow, our time. Tom Switzer is a research associate at the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. He's with us now. Tom, welcome.
Happy New Year, John.
Now, this seems to be a cycle after every mass shooting in the United States. They look at the issue of gun violence. Happened after Aurora. It has happened after Newtown in Connecticut as well. But it seems this time there's more of a push to get something done. Are they going to get something done?
I suspect they will, and I think Americans are increasingly looking at John Howard and the role that he played after the Port Arthur tragedy in 1996. And many influential Liberal columnists at the New York Times editorial page have argued that his model could be a blueprint for President Obama. In fact, the Times, which, as you know, John, is a left Liberal newspaper, has actually commissioned John Howard to write such an article, and he will do so in the next few weeks. And he'll make the point that President Obama has this wonderful opportunity to enact this far-reaching gun legislation because he's a newly elected, re-elected president. He has a huge amount of power and prestige. And of course, his Republican opponents are in all sorts of political disarray, so this gives him a great opportunity to enact some kind of gun legislation.
But wasn't that the point with John Howard, that it was a Conservative who was saying we've got to get some kinds of guns out of people's hands after what happened at Port Arthur? It's going to be much harder for Barack Obama. When he was elected 4 years ago, gun sales shot up. Everyone said he's going to take our guns off us.
Yes, I know. Well, that's exactly right. I mean, in a way, just as only Nixon could go to China, only a Republican could enact a gun legislation. So it will be a problem, particularly when the broad cross-section of the Republican Party, even in the northern states, are fairly opposed to a lot of these gun restrictions. And indeed, bear in mind, a lot of Democrats from regional areas are also very concerned about losing their gun rights. I mean, this is a point that John Howard often makes. There is a big cultural difference between the United States and Australia on this issue, and that's going to be the real roadblock in terms of trying to get meaningful reform. But the kind of thing that Gabby Giffords is talking about, these are more moderate, measured changes that can be escalated over time, that has a much better chance.
There has been a finessing of language. They're now trying to talk about gun safety rather than gun control, because people equate gun control as meaning I lose my gun.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. I mean, the Constitution would have to be radically changed for Howard-style reforms to be enacted, and that would, basically end the Second Amendment for the right to bear guns. So, look, these are things that politicians on both sides of the political divide will deal with, but it is interesting that Howard is being used as a way of being a blueprint for President Obama on this issue.
Peter Reith, of course, you were there in 1996 when all this was happening. What do you think the lessons for the United States might be from that period in Australia's history?
I rather agree with Tom's point. I mean, the difference in the culture in Australia compared to the US is so different, is so great, that, it is very hard for us to, sort of comprehend the way in which the Americans think about it. I mean, the National Rifle Association, in response to this latest disaster, stands up and says, oh, well, part of the answer is for all teachers to have guns. I mean, what, would they be safe guns, would they? I mean, I just find it's nearly sort of weird. I mean, I've got some very good friends in the United States, but, from an Australian perspective, the only way to deal with this is not just a safety issue, but, is to basically be taking guns off people. I mean, they've just got they've got an arsenal of, they're ready for World War III, these guys. And so it's a very hard one. I mean, you can only wish Barack Obama, well in trying to do something. I think from an Australian perspective, whatever he does, quite frankly, it's not going to look as if he's done much. I mean, it might, within the American political system, seem to be a pretty fair effort where he's attempting to go. But, they've got a hell of a long way to go. And the constitutional situation makes it virtually impossible for them to get as far as they really need to do and to go. The one thing I would say coming out of this, very interesting that John Howard should be invited to the New York Times. I bet you Paul Keating would be betting chips at the fact that, because it'll be a while since he's been invited by anybody to write a piece on anything.
Now, Tom Switzer, on Peter's point about America's different relationship to firearms, there are more than 300 million guns in the United States for 300 million people. Yeah. Right, they're one for one, essentially. How do you get people to give up their gun when they know the guy on this side of them and the guy on the person down the street, the guy at the committee? Everyone's got a gun. Why should I give up mine?
It's a rhetorical question. You've answered it. Yeah. Exactly right. I think it's going to be very difficult.
Yeah. When people, and the stream of logic from people of good conscience and good faith, good citizens say, when there is whether in Peter's case talking about the school shooting or the Aurora, Colorado cinema shooting, you said, the problem is we need more guns because if some of the people in that cinema had guns, they would have taken that crazy guy down before he killed more than a dozen people.
Well, interestingly, some states, such as Connecticut, do have tougher measures on gun control than other states. And clearly those laws do not stop this nutcase from going into the school and killing 20 young children as well as 6 teachers. So, look, these things are very complicated, but ultimately it's a cultural divide, and that's why the Howard proposals, I think, will struggle to get up because they're too far-reaching for the American people. And bear in mind, it's very hard to implement radical legislation in a country where politics is so polarised and divided.
Just quickly to you, Verity Firth, you've been spending a bit of time in the United States in the last election cycle. Do you have a sense that America is ready? Is this the kind of thing, a shooting in a primary school? Surely that's enough to shock people into action.
You'd think, wouldn't you? You'd think that when you have had something like that, that this is the time. But, I agree with Tom. It is so different over there. I also think the role of the NRA is very interesting in all of this. Evidently, you probably know better than me, but after Martin Luther King's assassination, there were gun law reforms. The NRA at that point backed them in. It was, but at that stage, it was more of a sort of sporting organisation, look after your gun sort of organisation. And then in 1977, it was taken over by real extremists. And the role that the NRA has played in American politics ever since has been so damaging because I don't know where they are, but what they need to find are the moderate gun owners, the sort of sporting shooters, the people that can provide a bit of buttress to the Republican...
People like Gabby Giffords and Mark Kelly,
that's what they need to find, but it's the NRA is so extreme.
Let's stay in the United States now, because President Barack Obama, freshly re-elected last November, he's got a couple of fights looming with congressional Republicans just after he got over that fiscal cliff. This time it's all about his nominees to a couple of national security posts. Fresh from all of those bruising battles, Barack Obama needs the Senate, including the Republicans in the Senate, to confirm his picks for the defence portfolio and the CIA directorship as well. But Senate Republicans and even some Democrats have expressed reservations about Senator Chuck Hagel, who is likely to become the next head of the Defence Department if confirmed. They're even stalling on John Brennan as head of the CIA because they say there are still questions unanswered about last week's Benghazi consulate attack. Now, Tom Switzer, first to Chuck Hagel. Explain to us, this guy he's a Republican, former senator, and now Senate Republicans are saying we don't want him as Defence Secretary. Why is this?
Well, not only that, John, but he's also a Vietnam vet, a decorated war veteran who still has shrapnel in his chest. So he has impeccable... credentials you'd have to think on military issues, and he would actually be the first Vietnam vet to be appointed as the head of the Pentagon. But why is he facing a firestorm in the Senate? Well, it's quite clear that in the last 10 years, especially since 9/11, the Republicans have adopted a more neoconservative attitude with respect to foreign policy. They believe that America should be a global hegemon, assert itself unilaterally around the world, and that, of course, means when it comes to threats from rogue regimes like Iran, that the doctrine of prevention, the Bush doctrine of prevention, should be applied if Iran does not conform.
And you're saying the neocons still have sway in Washington? They didn't get booted out with George W. Bush?
No, that's right. I think that mindset is still very much valid. And in fact, many of these legislators, and you see a few of them in the Democratic side, but they're pronounced in the Republican side, they're talking as if it's 2003. And of course, one of the great lessons learnt since 2003, and this is a point that Chuck Hagel himself makes, is that when you're dealing with rogue regimes, even regimes that have the capacity to develop weapons of mass destruction, they can be contained via the tried and tested policy of deterrence. Deterrence can't work against terrorists who can run and hide, but rogue states have a mailing address, they have fixed assets, and if Ahmadinejad or the mullahs use weapons of mass destruction against Israel or American interests in the region, it would guarantee massive retaliation. So force should be applied very reluctantly, and that's all Chuck Hagel is saying. And he's said that time and again throughout his last few years in the Senate.
So will Obama get his man?
I suspect he will. It will be a tough confirmation fight. He will be subjected to a lot of fierce scrutiny. It could even develop 1989. President Bush Sr.'s first Defence Secretary nominee was John Tower, a veteran Republican senator from Texas. He should have been the nominee instead of Dick Cheney, but he failed because the Democrats ran this nasty witch hunt about his alleged womanising and alcohol abuse, and his nomination sunk. Likewise, in 1997, President Clinton's nominee for the CIA director, Tony Lake, he also failed. These confirmation hearings are very tough. They go into your private lives, and let's be frank, the Israel lobby, which is a very powerful, pronounced group in Washington, are making it quite clear that they have him in their sights. So he'll be under the gun.
Want to get people's thoughts on this final story tonight. Disgraced former cycling champion Lance Armstrong says he will sit down for an interview with Oprah Winfrey next week, and it is assumed that he will be telling all about his doping. Armstrong was stripped, of course, of his 7 Tours de France titles and banned for life from professional cycling after being found guilty of taking performance-enhancing drugs. He's never actually admitted to that cheating and has refused to defend the charges, didn't contest them either. But it seems that Lance Armstrong is now paving the way for a possible comeback, and everybody loves a comeback. He wants to run triathlons and get involved with professional running for God knows what reason. So, will a mea culpa from Lance Armstrong, Verity Firth, be enough? Americans as a whole, they love the third act, don't they?
Yeah, probably.
Review of the week.
Yeah, I mean, I assume he must be about to confess, because you couldn't talk to Oprah for 90 minutes and then not confess. So I assume it is going to be a confession. And, you know, if it's done right with the right amount of browbeating and hand-wringing, I think it'll work. They'll love it. They'll lap it up.
Yeah, he's going to cry.
Peter Lloyd, do you reckon he's going to cry?
Absolutely. Look, never say never in America, because you know, I was there covering O.J. Simpson, and this guy chopped his wife's head off, stabbed the boyfriend in the garden, got away with murder, and after that still had a place in civil society. Yeah, right. He made money, he went out to dinner, he had friends who identified with him in public. He got away with murder in the most outrageous way. Yes, it eventually all caught up with him when he did something else. But look, if you can knock off your wife and a boyfriend, you can admit to taking some drugs.
Peter Reeve?
Well, he's moved from his sort of profession as a sportsman to, I would say, to a new career, which will be entertainment. You know, good luck to him. I mean, I know a few ex-pollies have moved into entertainment themselves. So, you know, it's the sort of thing you do later in life, and looks like he's going to do that. Whether it'll succeed, I don't know. I think people... You know, I think the tarnish has come off him, that's for sure. Yeah,
but the program could be called Living with Lance. It'll be an HBO.
Tom Switzer, do you think that redemption is in the wind?
Yeah, it's conceivable, but I'm generally sceptical. There is, of course, a heart-wrenching personal story of Lance Armstrong overcoming cancer, and he wrote his famous book about that very issue. It touches the thoughts and attitudes of a lot of people. But look, he's been in denial about this for way too long, and I think it's a bit rich now to finally come up and spill the beans, even to Oprah.
Is that the tragedy of all this, that great story about him has now been overlooked?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a sad moral tale, but I agree with Peter, essentially. I don't think he'll bounce back from this adversity. All
right, Tom Switzer, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and thanks to our panel as well, Verity Firth, Peter Lloyd and Peter Reeve. I hope you can join us at the same time tomorrow night. Thanks for your company. Bye for now.